What started as a simple question quickly turned into an on-air clash that no one was expecting to see unfold. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a guest known for being easygoing suddenly feels the need to draw a line on air? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began the same way most daytime talk show interviews do, with a warm introduction and polite applause as Zac Efron walked out onto the stage. He greeted the hosts with smiles, exchanged a few friendly hugs, and took his seat at the table, visibly relaxed and in good spirits. The panel welcomed him back, noting that it had been a while since his last appearance, and immediately referenced his latest project, which was a documentary-style series focused on travel, wellness, and environmental issues. The opening minutes of the conversation stayed firmly in familiar territory. The hosts asked about his recent filming locations, the physical challenges of traveling to remote areas, and what inspired him to move into more documentary-style work after years of acting in major Hollywood films. Zac responded calmly and thoughtfully, explaining that he had reached a point in his career where he wanted to learn new things, explore different cultures, and share those experiences with audiences in a more grounded way. He talked about filming in rural areas, meeting local communities, and being exposed to different lifestyles. The audience reacted positively, nodding and laughing at some of his lighter stories about getting lost, trying unfamiliar foods, and dealing with unexpected travel problems. The tone was conversational and easy, with the hosts chiming in with their own anecdotes and jokes. Joy Behar then shifted the conversation slightly, bringing up how different this version of Zac seemed compared to his early career. She referenced his time as a teen star and how the public perception of him had changed over the years. At first, the question was framed lightly, with Joy saying something along the lines of how he had grown up in front of everyone, and now seemed like a completely different person. Zac smiled and agreed, saying that growing up in the spotlight had been a strange experience and that he was grateful for the opportunities, but also felt pressure at a young age to live up to certain expectations. He mentioned how he had learned to set boundaries and take more control over the projects he chooses. Joy then followed up with a more pointed question. She suggested that some people might see his shift toward wellness and environmental topics as a kind of image correction, implying that he was trying to distance himself from earlier controversies or public struggles. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was noticeably more direct than the previous questions. There was a brief pause at the table. Zac's expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that viewers could sense a shift in the energy. He leaned back a little in his chair, took a moment before responding, and maintained eye contact with Joy as he answered. He said that he didn't see his current work as rebranding or correcting anything. Instead, he described it as personal growth that happened naturally over time. He explained that people evolve, especially when they've been working since they were teenagers, and that it didn't feel fair to frame that evolution as some kind of strategic move. Joy listened but pushed a bit further, saying that from the outside, it can look like celebrities go through phases and then suddenly present a new version of themselves once public opinion changes. She asked whether he felt pressure to maintain a certain image now that he's older and more aware of how public narratives work. At this point, the conversation became more tense, though still polite. Zac's voice remained calm, but his responses became more deliberate. He said that he understood why people might interpret things that way, but he wanted to be clear that his decisions were based on personal interest, not public relations. He added that living under constant scrutiny had taught him to care less about how things appear and more about whether his work feels meaningful to him. He explained that earlier in his career, he didn't always feel like he had control over his public identity, and now he prioritizes authenticity over perception. One of the other hosts tried to lighten the mood by joking about how everyone reinvents themselves at different stages of life, whether they're famous or not. The audience laughed, and for a moment it seemed like the tension might ease. But Joy returned to the topic again, saying that viewers often feel invested in celebrities and want to understand what's genuine and what's performative. She asked fairly directly whether Zac thought his current persona was truly different or just a more carefully managed version of what he's always been. This was the moment where Zac visibly pushed back. He didn't raise his voice or appear angry, but his tone became firmer. He said that he didn't agree with the idea that everything a public figure does should be viewed through a lens of performance. He explained that while he understands the business side of entertainment, not every personal decision is calculated. He said something to the effect of, "I'm just a person who happens to work in a public job. I don't wake up thinking about how to shape a narrative. I wake up thinking about what I want to learn, what I want to experience, and what feels right for me at this stage of my life." There was a noticeable shift in the studio. The audience quieted, and the host seemed more attentive. The conversation had moved away from casual promotion and into something more reflective and personal. Joy responded by saying she wasn't trying to accuse him of being fake, but rather pointing out how difficult it is for audiences to separate a celebrity's real self from their public image. She emphasized that it was a general observation, not a personal attack. Zac nodded, acknowledging her point, but clarified again that he felt it was important to resist that assumption. He said that constantly framing personal growth as image management can be frustrating, especially for people who have spent years trying to break out of boxes created by early fame. Another host added that Zac's generation of actors had faced unique pressures because of social media and constant online commentary. Zac agreed and mentioned that social media had amplified everything, making it harder to just exist without interpretation or judgment. The conversation slowed, becoming more thoughtful. Joy seemed to soften her tone, saying that she appreciated his honesty and that these kinds of discussions were valuable because they show how complicated public life can be. Zac responded by saying he welcomed open conversations, but also felt it was important for people to allow room for sincerity without assuming hidden motives. He said that not every change is strategic, and not every new interest is part of a brand. The audience applauded lightly, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of supportive reaction that usually follows a sincere moment on a talk show. The energy at the table stabilized, though it remained more serious than at the start of the segment. As the hosts transitioned toward the next topic, the tone remained respectful, but viewers could tell that something slightly uncomfortable had just happened. It wasn't a confrontation in the traditional sense, but it was a clear example of a guest gently pushing back against a narrative being placed on them in real time. The segment continued with lighter questions about travel stories and upcoming projects, but the earlier exchange lingered in the background. Zac remained engaged and friendly, but more measured, choosing his words carefully and maintaining a composed, thoughtful presence. For viewers watching live, the moment stood out not because it was explosive, but because it felt genuine. It was one of those subtle daytime television moments where the polished surface briefly gives way to something more real, and both sides have to navigate it carefully, in front of cameras and a studio audience, without losing control of the conversation. As the conversation moved forward, the hosts tried to gently steer things back toward lighter ground, but the shift in tone from earlier was still present. Zac remained relaxed in his posture, but his body language showed a subtle change. He sat a bit more upright, his hands resting together on the table instead of casually gesturing as before, and he seemed more focused on choosing his words carefully. One of the co-hosts picked up on the travel aspect again, asking him about a specific episode from his documentary series where he visited a remote coastal community. Zac responded with a story about learning traditional fishing methods and how it made him reflect on sustainability and the way people interact with nature. His voice was calm, and the audience responded well, laughing at some of the lighter moments in the story. But even as the conversation flowed, there was a noticeable difference in how Joy approached her next question. She didn't go back to the earlier topic immediately, but she framed her comments in a more reflective way, saying that watching him talk about these experiences made her wonder how much fame changes the way someone sees the world. She said that when someone becomes famous very young, their reality is shaped by access, money, and attention in ways most people never experience, and she asked whether he felt that his current lifestyle was partly a reaction to that earlier environment. Zac paused again, this time slightly longer. He nodded slowly before answering, acknowledging that fame absolutely shaped his life in ways he's still trying to understand. He said that being exposed to so much at such a young age can create a distorted sense of what's normal, and that part of his journey now is about reconnecting with simpler things and more grounded experiences. Joy listened carefully and then added that from a viewer's perspective, that kind of shift can look dramatic, almost like a complete personality change. She said audiences sometimes struggle to reconcile the version of a celebrity they grew up watching with the person they see now. Zac agreed with that observation, but gently emphasized again that people aren't static. He said that if someone met him today for the first time, without any knowledge of his early career, they would probably just see a person who enjoys traveling and learning about the world, not someone reinventing himself. This time, his pushback felt less defensive and more explanatory. He wasn't rejecting the question outright, but he was clearly trying to reframe the way it was being discussed. He said that the idea of reinvention often comes from the outside, not from within. Joy responded by saying she found that interesting, because as a talk show host, she's constantly analyzing how public figures present themselves. She said that it's part of her job to ask questions that viewers might be thinking, even if those questions feel uncomfortable. Zac nodded and said he understood that completely. He said he wasn't offended by the question, but he wanted to make sure the conversation didn't unintentionally reduce personal growth to marketing strategy. He explained that there's a difference between managing your career and managing your identity. The audience reacted with another small round of applause, the kind that usually happens when a guest articulates something relatable. The atmosphere in the studio felt more reflective now, less promotional and more conversational. One of the other hosts jumped in and said that what Zac was describing sounded like something many people go through in their 30s, famous or not. She said that a lot of people reach a point where they reassess their priorities and try to live more intentionally. Zac smiled and agreed, saying that he didn't think his experience was unique, just more visible. He said that most people get to evolve privately, while he's done it in front of millions of people who already have expectations about who he's supposed to be. Joy then made a comment about how visibility changes everything, because even sincere choices can be interpreted through layers of public opinion, media narratives, and online commentary. She said that in some ways, celebrities lose ownership of their own stories. Zac responded thoughtfully, saying that's exactly why he tries not to engage too much with external narratives anymore. He said that reading too many opinions about himself made it harder to trust his own instincts, and that stepping away from that noise helped him reconnect with what actually matters to him. At this point, the tension had softened into something more philosophical. The earlier edge in the conversation was still there, but it had transformed into a deeper discussion about fame, identity, and perception. Joy asked one more question related to the topic, but this time her tone was noticeably gentler. She asked whether he ever worries that audiences won't accept future changes, no matter how genuine they are. Zac smiled slightly and said that used to worry him a lot. He explained that earlier in his career, he felt pressure to meet expectations and stay consistent with the version of himself people were familiar with. But over time, he realized that trying to satisfy everyone is impossible. He said that now he's more comfortable with the idea that some people will connect with what he's doing and others won't, and that's okay. He said his main goal is to stay honest with himself, even if that means disappointing some fans who prefer the older version of him. The audience responded with a stronger round of applause this time, clearly resonating with the sentiment. The hosts smiled, and one of them made a light comment about how that sounded like good life advice for anyone, not just celebrities. Joy laughed and agreed, saying she wasn't trying to put him on trial, just trying to understand how public identity works in an era where everything is documented and analyzed. She said that his perspective was refreshing and more nuanced than the typical celebrity narrative. Zac thanked her and said he appreciated the opportunity to talk about it openly. He said that these kinds of conversations are important because they humanize people who are often treated as symbols or brands rather than individuals. As the segment moved toward its next phase, the producers signaled a short break. The hosts briefly summarized what had been discussed, and Joy made a final comment about how interesting it is to watch people grow in real time. Zac smiled politely and nodded, but his expression suggested he was still processing the exchange. He remained composed and professional, but there was a subtle sense that he had drawn a boundary earlier and wanted to make sure it stayed respected. For viewers at home, the moment didn't feel like a clash in the dramatic sense, but it did feel significant. It was one of those quiet on-air moments where a guest gently challenges the framing of a question, and in doing so, shifts the entire tone of the conversation. Instead of being a simple promotional interview, the segment had turned into a broader discussion about authenticity, perception, and the cost of growing up in the public eye. And while the conversation remained polite and controlled, the underlying tension made it far more engaging than a standard talk show appearance. When the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere felt slightly different from before. The energy was still calm and professional, but there was a noticeable sense that both the hosts and Zac were more aware of how carefully the conversation needed to be handled. The audience applauded as the cameras came back on, and Zac smiled and waved lightly, maintaining the same composed demeanor he had throughout the segment. One of the co-hosts restarted the discussion by referencing Zac's upcoming film project, shifting the focus back toward his acting career. She asked how it felt returning to a more traditional movie role after spending so much time on documentary-style work. Zac responded positively, saying it felt good to step back into a scripted environment, but he also mentioned that his experiences traveling had changed how he approaches storytelling. He explained that being around real people in real situations had made him more sensitive to nuance and detail, and that he now looks for roles that feel more grounded and realistic. The audience reacted with interest, and a few people nodded along as he spoke. Joy then re-entered the conversation, this time connecting his answer to the earlier discussion. She said that what he was describing sounded like a shift in values, and asked whether he felt Hollywood itself was changing in terms of what kinds of stories get told and what kinds of personalities succeed. Zac took a moment before answering, clearly considering the question. He said he thought the industry was slowly evolving, especially as audiences become more interested in authenticity and less interested in polished celebrity personas. He added that social media has changed expectations, making it harder for public figures to maintain a carefully constructed image. Joy responded by saying that in her experience, the public often claims to want authenticity, but still reacts strongly when celebrities deviate from familiar roles. She gave examples of actors who were criticized for changing their style, political views, or public behavior, and said that audiences sometimes punish people for evolving. Zac agreed with that, saying it's a complicated dynamic. He said that people form emotional connections with public figures, especially those they've watched since childhood, and those connections can create resistance to change. He said that he understands that reaction, but also feels that it's important for individuals to grow regardless of external expectations. At this point, the conversation felt more like a roundtable discussion than a typical interview. The hosts were no longer just asking questions, but sharing their own perspectives. One of them mentioned how even talk show hosts themselves face similar scrutiny when they change opinions or presentation styles. Joy nodded and said that being on television for decades means constantly being interpreted by viewers who feel they know you personally. She said that sometimes people forget that what they see on screen is only a small part of a person's life. Zac responded by saying that was exactly why he tries to keep certain parts of his life private now. He said that earlier in his career, he shared a lot, partly because it was expected and partly because he didn't know how to separate his personal and professional identities. But over time, he learned that having boundaries made him feel more balanced. Joy then asked a question that brought the tension back, though in a more subtle way. She said that some critics argue that when celebrities talk about privacy and boundaries, it can sound contradictory, given that their careers depend on public attention. She asked whether he ever feels conflicted about wanting both visibility and privacy at the same time. Zac smiled slightly, acknowledging the complexity of the question. He said that it is a contradiction in some ways, and that he doesn't think there's a perfect solution. He said that working in entertainment means accepting a certain level of exposure, but that doesn't mean every aspect of one's life should be open for interpretation. He explained that there's a difference between sharing work and sharing identity. He said he's comfortable promoting his projects, talking about his interests, and engaging with audiences, but he doesn't feel obligated to explain every personal choice or life decision. Joy listened, and then said that from a media perspective, it's often hard to know where that line should be drawn. She said journalists and hosts are trained to ask personal questions because that's what audiences respond to, but that those questions can sometimes cross into territory that feels intrusive. Zac responded calmly, saying he doesn't blame anyone for doing their job, but he does think it's healthy for public figures to push back gently when a conversation feels like it's moving toward assumptions rather than understanding. That statement seemed to resonate with the audience. There was a brief pause, followed by light applause. The hosts exchanged glances, and one of them smiled and said that this was turning into a very thoughtful conversation for a daytime show. Joy laughed and said that sometimes these are the best segments, when things go slightly off script. She said that while the show has a structure, the most interesting moments often come from unscripted exchanges. Zac agreed, saying that he prefers conversations that feel organic rather than overly rehearsed. He said that real dialogue, even when it's a bit uncomfortable, is more meaningful than perfectly polished interviews. The mood in the studio felt more relaxed again, though the discussion remained serious. The earlier tension had evolved into mutual respect, with both sides acknowledging the complexity of the topics being discussed. One of the hosts then brought up how Zac has been perceived as a role model for younger audiences, especially given his early fame. She asked whether he feels any responsibility to set an example, or whether he tries to avoid that kind of pressure. Zac responded thoughtfully, saying that he's aware people look up to him, but he doesn't see himself as a moral authority. He said that he tries to act in ways he can stand behind, but he also believes it's unrealistic to expect celebrities to represent ideal behavior at all times. Joy added that the public often demands consistency from famous people, even though regular individuals are allowed to be contradictory and imperfect. She said that celebrities are rarely given the same grace. Zac nodded and said that's something he's had to come to terms with. He said that making peace with imperfection has been a big part of his personal growth, and that trying to appear flawless only leads to stress and burnout. As the segment continued, the conversation felt increasingly reflective and less promotional. The hosts asked fewer direct questions about specific projects and more about experiences, values, and perspectives. For viewers watching at home, it was clear that the initial disagreement had shifted the entire direction of the interview. What started as a typical talk show appearance had turned into a broader discussion about fame, identity, boundaries, and authenticity. Zac remained composed throughout, but there was a sense that he had established a clearer stance on how he wanted to be perceived. He wasn't rejecting the public's interest, but he was gently resisting being defined solely by narratives created by others. Joy, for her part, seemed more measured in her follow-ups, framing her questions with more context and less implication. The dynamic between them felt more balanced now, with both sides engaging thoughtfully rather than defensively. The audience continued to respond positively, reacting with light applause and attentive silence at key moments. It was the kind of segment that didn't rely on dramatic conflict, but on subtle shifts in tone and perspective, making it feel more authentic and engaging than a standard celebrity interview. As the conversation progressed further, the producers appeared to lean into the more thoughtful direction the segment had taken. The hosts stopped moving quickly from topic to topic and instead allowed the discussion to breathe, giving Zac more space to elaborate on his answers. The pacing slowed, and the studio felt quieter, with the audience listening more intently than reacting. One of the co-hosts mentioned that it was refreshing to hear a celebrity speak so openly about personal limits and identity, especially in an industry where oversharing has become common. She asked Zac whether he felt pressure from fans to constantly explain himself online, especially when rumors or speculation surface. Zac nodded and said that pressure definitely exists, but he's learned to resist it. He explained that earlier in his career, he felt compelled to respond to everything, whether it was a rumor, a headline, or a comment. He said that it became exhausting and unhealthy, and that over time he realized silence is sometimes the most honest response. Joy reacted to that by saying that silence can also be interpreted in many ways, especially in the age of social media. She said that when public figures don't address something, people often assume the worst or fill in the gaps themselves. Zac agreed with that, but said that trying to control every narrative is impossible. He explained that even when he does speak up, people still interpret his words differently depending on their own perspectives. He said that at some point, you have to accept that you can't manage how everyone sees you. Joy then made a comment that gently brought back the earlier tension. She said that from a viewer's standpoint, when someone changes their public behavior and then chooses not to explain it, it can feel like something is being hidden. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but the implication was clear. Zac responded carefully. He said he understood why people might feel that way, but he disagreed with the idea that privacy automatically means secrecy. He said that not sharing something doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong or dishonest behind it. Sometimes it just means it's personal. He explained that for a long time, he felt obligated to perform openness, to constantly show people who he was and what he was doing. But eventually he realized that real authenticity doesn't require constant disclosure. The audience reacted with quiet approval, a few people nodding, and a soft ripple of applause. The atmosphere remained respectful, but the conversation had returned to a more delicate balance, with both sides clearly aware they were discussing something sensitive. Joy listened, and then said that her questions come from a place of curiosity, not judgment. She said that talk shows exist because people are fascinated by other people's lives, especially those they see on screen. She said that sometimes hosts forget that curiosity can cross into assumption. Zac smiled slightly and said that he appreciated her saying that. He said that he doesn't mind being asked difficult questions, but he does think it's important to separate curiosity from conclusions. He said that the moment someone assumes intent, the conversation changes. One of the other hosts stepped in and said that this exchange itself was a good example of how easily misunderstandings can happen in public conversations. She said that even when everyone is being respectful, tone and framing matter a lot. Joy agreed and said that being on live television makes everything more intense, because there's no time to rewrite or soften what's been said. She said that moments like this remind her how powerful words can be when millions of people are listening. Zac added that being on live TV also means guests have to think on their feet, especially when questions touch on personal topics. He said that sometimes you answer instinctively and only later realize how your words might be interpreted. At this point, the tension had turned into something more reflective again. The disagreement hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into mutual acknowledgement of the complexities involved in public conversations. Joy then asked one final question related to the topic, but framed it more openly. She asked whether he felt more at peace with himself now than he did earlier in his career. Zac paused for a moment, then said yes, in a general sense. He explained that peace doesn't mean everything is perfect, but it means he feels more comfortable with uncertainty and change. He said that earlier in his life, he felt pressure to define himself clearly, whereas now he's more okay with not having all the answers. Joy responded by saying that sounded like emotional maturity. She said that many people spend their whole lives trying to reach that point. Zac laughed softly and said he wouldn't go that far, but he does feel more grounded than he used to. He said that stepping away from constant validation and comparison helped him reconnect with himself. The audience reacted warmly, and the mood in the studio lightened slightly. One of the hosts made a gentle joke about how everyone could use a little less social media and a little more self-reflection. Joy laughed and agreed, saying that maybe the real takeaway from the segment was about learning to let go of other people's expectations. Zac smiled and said that was something he was still learning, but it felt like the right direction. As the segment began to wind down, the hosts thanked him for being open and engaging in such an honest conversation. Joy added that she appreciated his willingness to challenge her perspective respectfully. Zac thanked her in return and said he appreciated her asking thoughtful questions, even when they made him think more deeply than expected. The exchange ended on a calm, professional note. There was no dramatic resolution, no raised voices or visible conflict, but the subtle tension remained part of the segment's identity. For viewers, the moment stood out precisely because it felt real. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point, but about navigating disagreement in a public space, with both sides trying to be understood without escalating the situation. The studio audience applauded as the hosts transitioned to the final moments of the show, and Zac leaned back in his chair, visibly more relaxed than he had been earlier, as if the emotional intensity of the discussion had finally eased. As the segment reached its final stretch, the overall tone in the studio had settled into something calm and reflective. The tension that had surfaced earlier never fully disappeared, but it softened into a kind of quiet understanding between Zac and the hosts. The conversation no longer felt like a debate or a push and pull, but more like a shared acknowledgement that public conversations are complicated, especially when they touch on identity and perception. One of the producers signaled that they were running short on time, and the hosts began to move toward wrapping up the interview. One of the co-hosts asked Zac a final, lighter question about his upcoming projects, specifically what audiences could expect next, and whether he planned to continue balancing acting with documentary-style work. Zac responded in a relaxed tone, saying that he enjoys having variety in his career now. He said he doesn't want to limit himself to one type of project and feels fortunate to have the freedom to explore different creative directions. He mentioned that he has a film coming out later in the year and is also developing another travel-based series, though nothing was finalized yet. The audience responded with polite applause, and the mood in the room felt noticeably more at ease. The earlier seriousness gave way to the familiar rhythm of a talk show closing, with smiles, light laughter, and brief promotional mentions. Joy then offered a closing comment, saying that regardless of the deeper conversation, it was good to see him back on the show and that she appreciated his honesty. Her tone was warm and sincere, and it felt like a genuine attempt to end the segment on a positive note. Zac smiled and thanked all of the hosts for having him. He said he enjoyed the conversation and appreciated being given the space to talk about things that matter to him, not just his latest projects. As the camera pulled back slightly and the hosts began their standard sign-off, the studio audience applauded more strongly. It wasn't the kind of explosive applause reserved for dramatic moments, but the steady, supportive reaction typical of a respectful and engaging segment. For viewers watching live, the ending felt natural. There was no clear winner or dramatic conclusion, just a sense that something meaningful had been discussed and handled calmly on both sides. Almost immediately after the episode aired, the segment began circulating on social media. Short clips of the exchange between Zac and Joy were shared across platforms, particularly the moments where he pushed back on the idea of his personal growth being a form of image management. Some viewers praised Zac for staying calm and articulate, saying that he handled the questions thoughtfully and set reasonable boundaries without being confrontational. Many comments highlighted how refreshing it was to see a celebrity speak honestly about fame, privacy, and identity on a daytime talk show. Others defended Joy, pointing out that her job is to ask challenging questions and that her comments reflected how many viewers genuinely think about celebrity behavior. Some felt the exchange was a good example of healthy dialogue rather than conflict. There were also viewers who felt slightly uncomfortable with the segment, not because anyone behaved badly, but because it exposed how easily assumptions can form in public conversations. A few people commented that the moment felt awkward in a subtle way, the kind of awkwardness that happens when real perspectives clash gently instead of dramatically. Entertainment news outlets picked up the story later that day, framing it as a thoughtful on-air moment, rather than a confrontation. Headlines focused on Zac's comments about authenticity and personal growth, and several articles noted how rare it is for daytime talk show interviews to move into such reflective territory. In follow-up interviews and online discussions, the hosts addressed the segment briefly, saying that they value conversations that go beyond surface-level promotion. Joy, in particular, mentioned that she appreciated Zac's perspective and that she didn't see the exchange as negative, but as an example of how open dialogue can lead to better understanding. Zac didn't directly comment on the moment in the days that followed, but in a later interview with another outlet, he echoed similar themes, saying that he's learned to speak up calmly when something doesn't sit right with him, especially in public settings. Looking back, the segment stood out not because of any dramatic clash, but because of how real it felt. It showed a version of daytime television that viewers don't always see, where conversations drift slightly off script and people have to navigate disagreement in real time, without rehearsed lines or carefully edited sound bites. The disagreement built slowly, emerged through tone and implication rather than direct conflict, and resolved through mutual respect rather than confrontation. It was the kind of moment that felt authentic precisely because it wasn't sensational. By the end of the show, the studio had returned to its usual energy, but the segment left a lasting impression. It reminded viewers that even in polished, friendly television environments, real conversations can happen, and that those conversations don't need to be loud or dramatic to be meaningful. And for audiences at home, it offered something slightly different from the usual celebrity interview. Instead of just hearing about upcoming projects, they saw a public figure thoughtfully explain how he sees himself, how he responds to public narratives, and how he chooses to define his own growth. In the end, the moment wasn't about controversy. It was about perspective, boundaries, and the quiet complexity of being a person in the public eye, trying to stay genuine while millions of people watch and interpret every word. And now, I'd love to hear what you think about this exchange. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.